And Mastewal is going to speak to us about how to craft a credible and inclusive implementation process for the national dialogue. Mastewal, thank you very much for joining us and for your time today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmed, and organizers for inviting me to take part in this very important conversation. I'm glad that I'm going last because many of the issues that I had prepared or wanted to emphasize have already been addressed. So I'm not going to repeat many of those. And I just want to start off before going to my topic of making sure the implementation process is credible and inclusive. I want to start off by clarifying my own views on two preliminary questions. The first question is Dr. Samir's point, which was, does Ethiopia need a national dialogue at this moment? My answer to that question is a definite yes. And the second one is, does the national dialogue as envisaged currently in its current form hold meaningful promise for Ethiopia? My answer to that question is a definite no. And I just wanted to put these premises first before I proceed with my presentation, which will focus on a different question, which is maybe something that Goitom tried to address. What types of changes to the current form should we advocate for, should we implement before the national dialogue can proceed so that it can indeed bring about genuine progress in Ethiopia? So I want to highlight two different contexts that haven't been addressed. I think context is critical because national dialogue, the literature on national dialogue shows us that its success really depends on a variety of political, economic, and historic contexts. So we have to address these contexts first. And many of the speakers have already dropped a few important contexts. Two that I want to highlight, in addition to all that's been said, is that in Ethiopia, the state structure and the political history shows that incumbents, autocratic governments, have a very established practice of weaponizing institutions, laws, democratic norms in order to implement their own political agenda. So this is a very established record. In 2018, when EPRDF technically accepted a transition and allowed for democratization, it acknowledged that in a way, and it admitted that it was weaponizing various democratic institutions and laws and processes like this type of process, even though it's not necessarily in its current form, to use it for its political ends. So that is a very critical context that should inform our understanding of whether we should be optimistic about this process, how much of trust can we put in it. So that's one context. And then the second one, something that the commissioners, ambassador and Dr. Jonas brought up, is the question or the emphasis on indigenous knowledges and indigenous systems. The reference to elders and religion and some of these values, indigenous values that Ethiopia has and can and should appropriately, obviously, be proud of and implement in these processes. We need to be wary of that rhetoric as well, because again, we have a track record of governments abusing these institutions, either rhetorically or through basically manipulating these very respectable institutions and elders to drive their own political agenda. So I think these contexts are very critical when we look at what the national dialogue process looks like and how it's being basically implemented. So having said that, I want to say that, the literature on national dialogue shows us that it can take various forms and the timeline and nature could vary. But generally, I think Dr. Samir also pointed this out, there are distinct phases. There's the preparation, the consultation at grassroots level or with limited elite, and then the conferencing, which is more at the regional national conference level, and then the implementation of outcomes. So there are distinct phases. Now, in Ethiopia's case, where are we on the timeline? Dr. Jonas gave us some insights. He said that they're in the preparatory process. But in here, when I talk about preparation, I'm looking at the process that even came before the establishment of the national dialogue. So it appears, based on the structure that I outlined, we are on the second stage of the process, consultation. The Commission already told us that it's been conducting various consultations with different actors. So did we skip the first phase, the preparation, the process of actually setting up the Commission? Obviously, we didn't. The preparation was done, but it was done not in an inclusive manner. It was done primarily by the current government using the institutions that it dominates, the parliament and the executive. And as we know, this government is not inclusive. It's dominated by one political party. And in addition, the process it followed, some of the questions from the audience have brought up those issues. The drafting of the legal instrument that set up the Commission the process of identifying what powers and mandates the commission will have, who it's going to be accountable for. These are all critical issues, as well as the individuals which constitute the commission. All of these preparatory processes were done in a process that's not inclusive. And they did not give opposition parties, civil society groups, and other stakeholders real meaningful opportunity to shape this preparation process. This is critical. And as a result, several opposition groups have outright rejected this initiative, boycotted it from the onset as some political theater that we're used to in Ethiopia. And for the same reason, there's not much public buy-in and engagement and enthusiasm about the process. So the very first prong of the process, the implementation, process was neither inclusive nor credible. So while this is so, we are looking at the commission is marching forward with its activities and predetermined schedule, and we seem to find ourselves in the second phase of consultation. In terms of its importance, in my opinion, and the literature also supports this, the second phase, the consultation phase, is another critical juncture. It is where the core issues and agendas for the dialogue will actually be identified, and the participants will also be identified. So if this step 2 is also not done in an inclusive and credible manner, it will basically preclude any success on the following 2 prongs, the conferencing and the implementation of outcomes, and it would totally down the whole initiative. So in my view, we are at this very important juncture, and a critical choice has to be made, both by the commission, the government, and also the public and other international actors who want to see this process actually bring about meaningful change. And the choice is either A, we shut our ears to the obvious defects that the stakeholders are voicing and just march forward with blind optimism that this would work. And this option would basically mean that the commission will set the agenda for the dialogue without the participation of various important stakeholders. And they will do that agenda setting in a process that's not credible. Or option B would be to heed the grievances of the various stakeholders. And these have been, out there. These political groups have issued statements. The political parties council, the Joint Council of Political Parties has been publicly trying to get the public support on its grievances, essentially. So these are out there for the commission and the government. So option B would be to heed these grievances and allow the necessary time and space for these shortcomings to be addressed before moving to step 3. Now, I urge the commissioners in attendance today and also the other commissioners and the government to choose this latter option and either refuse to move forward with the process and the predetermined schedule until these major issues of inclusivity and credibility are addressed, or prioritize at least these issues as its first agenda for the commission. And this is maybe where I depart a little bit from Goitom, in the sense that I don't think we necessarily have to postpone the dialogue before we move forward, before we address these issues, but maybe the commission has this great opportunity of establishing its credibility and its ability to deliver on this promise that the Ethiopian people are putting on it by prioritizing these preliminary issues as its first agenda. And that means, a lot of these grievances can be addressed through legislative, perhaps, or other procedural mechanisms. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'm going to throw around 2 examples of things that already other stakeholders have pointed out under each banner: inclusivity and credibility. On the inclusivity side, basic conditions for the national dialogue, and this is something that Dr. Samir and maybe Goitom also highlighted, have to be guaranteed. There has to be ceasefire so that basic security and peace is established in all parts of the country, so that not only at the grassroots level dialogue will be possible, but the stakeholders who purport to represent these people in different parts of the country can actually dialogue and take part in these discussions and consultations. So that's key. The end of the blockade of food in the Tigray region has to be prioritized. This is something that Goitom brought up, but the fact that this was not even brought up by the commissioners, I think is a bit puzzling to me, that there is a part of society in Ethiopia right now that is locked out of basic services, basic food, and humanitarian relief, not only for Tigray, for other parts of the country. People cannot engage in this type of participatory process without basic access, preliminary conditions, food, access to basic services are guaranteed. And then we can go on and on other things that could wait. But I think that these are really critical basic conditions. Now, the commission does not have power to implement this, but the commission has the ability And if the people believe in the commission's credibility, the people's support to prioritize these issues and take it to the stakeholders and say these preconditions have to be met. Second, on inclusivity, the commission should secure the legal and practical mechanisms whereby all these armed and non-armed groups that are not currently included or cannot take part because of legal impediments are included. How that would be, this is something that the lawyers can debate, but this is another priority, I think, for the commission to establish mechanisms whereby groups that are labeled terrorists or destructive forces and therefore cannot, be part of legal processes can come forward and take part in the agenda setting part of the consultation. And then finally, on the credibility, again, many things can be done. But one thing that the political parties first recommended, opposition parties, and was never accepted as a recommendation, was that the commission has to be accountable to an impartial body. The recommendation was that the commission has to be accountable to the president's office because the president, as the head of state, is impartial and is technically non-partisan. That was rejected essentially, and that's a major grievance that the political parties council had. But if possible, one thing that could boost the commission's credibility is essentially to make sure that it's not going to be accountable to the executive to the government that would essentially, nitpick and decide which outcomes it wants to implement after all. So that's one thing. Or at least the commission should be empowered to oversee and monitor the implementation and not just issue recommendations, because the proclamation currently allows the commission to just issue reports basically saying, we want the Prosperity Party-led government to do X, Y, Z, but nothing beyond that. And so one final thing, something the commissioners maybe could reflect on is, the government is one of the parties that we're concerned as being a force of interference, but it's not just the government that could interfere in the work of the commission. So I want to highlight that, the commission maybe could have a written pledge that it wants all, at least political stakeholders, to sign that would commit them to honor, be bound by, and be committed to the implementation of the outcomes, whatever those outcomes are, prior to the beginning of said agenda setting. Because already we're hearing, at least for the government, public messaging that this commission is not about power sharing, or this dialogue is not about coalition government. So it's already signaling what agendas are acceptable and whatnot. And you would hear the same from the other side. They're already signaling what agendas may be important and whatnot. But if the commission from the very early on, as a condition to obviously this participation, require the political stakeholders to commit in a written pledge to the public that they would honor and be bound by the outcomes of the negotiation, the dialogue, no matter what they are, at least, it's not a binding mechanism legally, but it's something that the public can hold the different stakeholders accountable. So I'm just going to wrap this up at this point, but there might be more issues that come up in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so
carry on with the long discussion, and it would be worth it, but time is not on our side. Can I therefore please invite Ambassador Mohammed Derir, Commissioner for the National Dialogue Commission of Ethiopia, to give his presentation. You have up to 12 minutes, Ambassador.